The night is cool, the air is calm, and somewhere near the edge of the sea a gentle wind moves across stone and sand, carrying a quiet sound that feels like history itself breathing slowly, and in the distance a small fire glows, not bright, not loud, just steady, the kind of light you stare at when you want your mind to drift, because the story of ancient Greece is not a single straight road, not one empire marching in a perfect line, not one king sitting on one golden throne, but instead a scattered world, a world of separate voices, separate harbors, separate hills, and separate cities that each believed they were the center of everything important. When we say ancient Greece, we do not mean one unified country in the modern sense, we mean a network of communities shaped by geography, shaped by mountains that cut valleys apart, shaped by narrow plains that can only feed so many people, shaped by islands that sit like stepping stones across the sea, and this geography creates a natural habit, a habit of living in small strong places instead of one large centralized state, and those small strong places become one of the most important ideas in Western history, the polis, the city-state. A polis is more than a settlement, more than walls and streets, it is a political identity, a social world, a sense of belonging so strong that a person might not call themselves Greek first, but instead Athenian, or Spartan, or Corinthian, because the city is the family, the city is the law, the city is the place where you trade, argue, vote, fight, worship, and grow old. And because each polis has its own habits and pride, every polis stands beside the others like a rival standing beside a rival, sometimes friendly, sometimes suspicious, sometimes openly hostile. In this world, competition is constant, it appears in trade, because ships carry olive oil, wine, pottery, metalwork, and grain across the sea, it appears in culture, because festivals, athletic contests, songs, and theater performances become ways to show prestige, and it appears in power, because walls must be built, weapons must be carried, and armies must be trained. And behind all of that competition there is one simple truth, that each polis wants to survive, and survival in a crowded neighborhood often depends on strength, planning, and discipline. And when we picture Greece, we should not imagine only the land we call Greece today, because the Greek world stretches outward like ripples, it reaches the western coast of Anatolia, it spreads across the Aegean Islands, it travels down to southern Italy and Sicily, it touches the coasts of the Black Sea, and everywhere these communities appear, you can feel the same pattern, small cities connected by sea routes and shared language, but divided by local pride and local politics. To understand how this world formed, we have to move slowly into the past, into a time before the famous temples and philosophers, into an older era where a different system existed, a system of palace centers, the Mycenaean world, with strong fortresses, kings, storerooms, and a written administration, but at some point that system fell apart, and the reasons are still debated: war, internal conflict, migration, pressure from outside, perhaps several causes at once, and what matters is the result. Palaces were destroyed, long-distance networks weakened, and many regions became quieter and smaller. A long period followed that historians sometimes call the Greek Dark Age, not because everything was empty and dead, but because the light of evidence becomes faint, because writing disappears for a time, and because large structures break into smaller communities, and in that quieter world, people focus on local survival, on family ties, on farming, on herding, and on rebuilding stability, and then, slowly, almost like dawn arriving on a cold sea, change begins again. One of those changes is technology, because iron becomes more common, iron tools support agriculture, iron weapons spread wider than elite bronze, and as food production improves, population can grow, and as population grows, land becomes a problem, because small valleys have limits, and those limits create pressure, a pressure that pushes people outward toward the sea, toward new coasts, toward new settlements. And this is where Greek colonization begins to shape the ancient Mediterranean. But colonization here is not exactly the modern image of distant control. Often it is a group leaving a parent city, traveling by ship, founding a new city on a new shore, and keeping a cultural bond with the homeland while building an independent polis of its own, and over time this creates a wide Greek presence across the sea, a chain of cities linked by trade, language, religious customs, and shared myths. As the centuries pass, the Greek world enters what we call the Archaic period, and the polis becomes stronger, more organized, and more ambitious, and inside many city-states a social pattern becomes visible. Aristocratic families dominate early politics, powerful landowners and elite warriors hold influence, but the story is never that simple, because the polis requires cooperation, it requires order, it requires a sense that the community is held together by rules, by expectations, and by shared risks, and the moment ordinary citizens feel excluded, tension begins to rise. One of the most defining features of the polis is its style of warfare, and it is important because it changes how people think about their role in society. The hoplite system, where heavily armed infantry stand shoulder to shoulder with round shields and long spears, forming a thick defensive line, and the power of that line comes not from one heroic fighter but from discipline, from unity, from each person protecting the next. And when citizens fight like that, they begin to believe that citizenship and contribution should matter, that participation in defense should carry weight in decision-making. And in this scattered world of rivalry and pride, two cities begin to rise in a way that will shape everything that follows, Sparta and Athens, not because they are the only important cities, but because their personalities become so distinct, and because their clash becomes a kind of mirror, showing two different answers to the same question: what is the best way to build a stable polis? And the two answers could not be more different. To begin with Sparta, we should not rush straight into battles, we should first walk into the land itself, because Sparta grows in the Peloponnese, in the Eurotas Valley, surrounded by mountains, less exposed to sea trade than many coastal cities, more inward, more guarded, and this geography encourages a different kind of strength, a strength based on land and disciplined control rather than on ships and open markets. Sparta's development is tied to conquest and to the control of fertile territory, especially the region of Messenia, and from this conquest a unique social structure emerges, because Sparta comes to rely on a large dependent farming population, the Helots, who work the land and produce food, while Spartan citizens focus more intensely on military training and social discipline. And this arrangement gives Sparta an unusual character, a society where the citizen body becomes a professional warrior class in everything but name. But behind Sparta's order there is always a shadow, because Helots are numerous, and Spartan citizens are fewer, and when a minority depends on the labor of a majority, it creates anxiety, and anxiety creates strictness, and strictness creates systems, and systems create habits that can last for centuries, and so Sparta's identity hardens, its culture becomes controlled, its priorities narrow. Its laws emphasize collective strength and reduced luxury, because anything that disrupts unity is viewed as dangerous. The famous figure associated with Sparta's system is Lycurgus, a name that sits between legend and history, and what matters is not whether every story about him is perfectly accurate, but that the Spartans believed in the idea of a lawgiver, someone who shaped their rules into something consistent, a way of life that demanded shared meals, shared training, and a certain rejection of display and personal softness. Because the goal was not individual brilliance but collective endurance, the ability to hold the line, the ability to remain stable no matter what pressures came from the outside or rose from within. And while Sparta becomes the symbol of discipline and controlled power, another city grows along a different path, Athens, a city whose strength will come not from isolation and strictness, but from openness, trade, debate, and the gradual invention of political participation, and this difference will shape the entire Greek world, because when Sparta and Athens rise, every other city begins to feel the pull of their influence, like smaller boats caught between two large currents. But at this moment in the story, we are still at the beginning, still before the famous wars, still before the great speeches and dramatic theaters, still before the names that echo through textbooks, and the most important thing to understand is this, that ancient Greece is a world of many small communities learning how to survive, learning how to compete, learning how to organize themselves, and that the choices they make, the slow choices of law, war, trade, and identity, will build the foundation for everything that comes next. And so, as the sea wind continues to move gently across the stones, we can let the story continue forward, step by step, city by city, until Sparta becomes fully formed in its strict way, and Athens begins its long transformation towards something new, and the entire Greek world becomes a stage where politics, war, culture, and human ambition meet under a sky that is sometimes bright, sometimes stormy, but always filled with movement. Sparta is not a city that announces itself with loud markets and shining ports. It is not a place that welcomes strangers with bright colors and endless conversation. It is a place that feels like stone and dry wind, a place that seems to be listening more than speaking, because Sparta grows in a land that rewards patience, control, and repetition. The Eurotas Valley, long and narrow, protected by mountains, steady in its seasons, steady in its quietness, and in that quietness a particular kind of society begins to harden into shape, not quickly, not in one sudden moment, but slowly, like iron cooling into a fixed form after being heated again and again. If you were walking towards Sparta in the ancient world, you would not first see a giant harbor full of ships, you would not see grand city walls rising above the horizon, you would see fields, paths, low hills, then the shape of settlements that feel practical rather than impressive, and when you finally reach the city itself, you might feel that it is a community that is intentionally restrained, as if the people here have decided that beauty should never become softness, and that comfort should never become weakness, and so even the way the city looks becomes part of the message, a message that says, we are here to endure, we are here to hold our ground. Sparta's early history is tied to movement, conquest, and consolidation, because in the Peloponnese there are valleys and plains that can feed people, and there are rival groups that also want those lands, and over time the Spartans expand control over neighboring territory, especially the rich agricultural region of Messenia, and that conquest changes everything, because conquest is not only land, conquest is people, And when you control a wide farming population, you can reshape your own citizens into something rare in the ancient world, a community that does not live for farming work, but instead lives for training and cohesion. That dependent farming population becomes known as the helots, and it is important to understand the emotional weight of this arrangement, because it creates abundance and fear at the same time, it creates stability and anxiety at the same time, it creates food and time for Spartans to train, but it also creates a constant pressure, because the people who do the work are many, and the Spartans who rule are fewer. And Sparta learns to think like a fortress even when it is not surrounded by walls. It becomes a fortress made of habits and rules, a fortress made of discipline, because discipline is the way a smaller citizen body keeps control of a larger dependent population. But Sparta is not only about fear, it is also about identity, about how a group can decide to become a single unit, and the Spartans build this unit through a system that shapes life from childhood to old age, a system that is famously associated with the name Lycurgus, a lawgiver who exists in the space between history and legend, and whether every detail is literal truth matters less than the larger truth. That Sparta believed its laws were sacred, timeless, necessary, and that those laws were designed to reduce internal conflict among citizens, to prevent luxury from splitting the community into jealous pieces, and to ensure that every Spartan citizen felt like part of a single machine. The Spartan system often begins with a simple idea, that the individual must be secondary to the community, and this idea shows itself in many ways. It shows itself in shared meals, in shared training, in expectations that personal ambition should be expressed through service rather than display, and in the constant reminder that the city survives only when citizens move together like a single body. And because of this, Sparta becomes almost the opposite of the world of poets and merchants. It becomes a society that treats order like oxygen. When a Spartan child is born, the community pays attention, not only the family, because the city sees itself as responsible for its future strength, and later, as the child grows, the most famous part of Spartan life begins, the agoge, the structured system of upbringing and training. And the agoge is not simply a school in the modern sense, it is an environment designed to teach endurance, obedience, cooperation, and emotional control, and it does this through constant routine, physical conditioning, discipline under authority, and a culture where complaining is not admired, where softness is viewed as a threat, and where the ability to remain calm under pressure becomes a kind of social currency. A Spartan boy does not grow up believing his life belongs only to his home. He grows up believing his life belongs to Sparta, and from a young age he learns that being watched is normal, being tested is normal, being challenged is normal, and in Sparta, even silence becomes a skill, because speaking too much suggests looseness, and so Spartans become famous for saying little and meaning a lot, the kind of speech that is sharp and short. And this style becomes part of their identity, almost like the way a soldier learns to carry a shield without thinking about it. And yet, even inside such a strict system, life still has ordinary moments, because humans remain human even under heavy discipline. There are mornings where the air is cold and the ground is hard. There are evenings where families share what time they can. There are festivals where music and ritual still exist, because religion is deeply woven into Greek life, even in Sparta. And the Spartans worship the same gods other Greeks worship, Zeus, Apollo, Artemis, Athena, and they consult oracles. They honor sacred days, they respect omens, because they believe that even the strongest city is nothing without divine favor. Spartan religion is often practical, focused on community protection, focused on stability, and you can imagine a Spartan festival not as a place of wild disorder, but as a controlled expression of unity, where people gather not only to celebrate, but to remind themselves that they are one community, one tradition, one line of continuity from the ancestors to the living. One of the most striking parts of Spartan daily life is the system of common meals, the syssitia, where adult male citizens eat together in groups, sharing food, sharing conversation, sharing a routine that reinforces equality among citizens, and even though not everyone is truly equal in wealth or influence, the ritual of eating together reduces the visible gaps. It makes the citizen body feel like a brotherhood. And in that brotherhood, the idea of private luxury is discouraged, because private luxury creates private loyalties, and private loyalties create division, and division is what Sparta fears most. The food itself is often described as simple and repetitive, a diet built for function rather than pleasure, and the most famous dish in later stories is the black broth, a meal that outsiders sometimes mock and Spartans accept, because the point is not to impress visitors, the point is to stay steady, to keep the body strong, to keep the mind calm, and to treat hunger as something manageable rather than dramatic. Sparta also develops an unusual approach to money and trade, because while other city-states become rich through maritime commerce and the constant movement of goods, Sparta tends to limit certain forms of economic display, and later writers claim Sparta used heavy iron currency to discourage accumulation and long-distance trade, and even if the exact details change with time, the bigger theme remains. Sparta does not want wealth to become a new form of power that disrupts the citizen unity. And so the city balances the need for resources with the fear of internal competition. But to truly understand Sparta, we must slowly map out its social layers, because Sparta is not just Spartans, it is a structured society with different groups living under different rules, and the top identity is the Spartiates, full Spartan citizens, men who belong to the core community, who have political rights, who participate in the common meals, who are expected to devote their lives to the city's defense and stability. Then there are the perioikoi, meaning something like those who live around, free people in surrounding communities under Spartan control, not full citizens, but important, because they often handle crafts, trade, and local industry. They provide goods and services that the core Spartan citizen body does not focus on, and they also support the wider system that keeps Sparta functioning. And then there are the helots, bound to the land, tied to agricultural labor, not free in the way Spartans are free, and their presence is the deep engine of the Spartan economy, because fields must be worked, grain must be harvested, food must reach the tables, and the fact that helots are numerous is what makes Sparta both powerful and anxious, because dependence creates vulnerability. And Sparta is a city that never forgets its vulnerabilities. Because of this, Sparta develops habits of caution, habits of control, and a political system designed to reduce sudden chaos, and this political system is not a pure monarchy, not a pure democracy, but a carefully balanced structure, with 2 kings, a council of elders, and an assembly, and officials known as ephors. And the design of this system is to prevent any one person or group from grabbing too much power too quickly, because when power becomes personal, the city becomes unstable. The 2 kings serve as symbols of continuity and leadership, often connected to military command and religious roles, but their power is not unlimited, because the elders and ephors provide oversight, and the council, the Gerousia, is made of older men, respected for their age and experience, and in many cultures age is respected, but in Sparta age becomes almost an institutional force, because older men represent memory, tradition, and the ability to resist impulsive change. The ephors, elected officials, become especially important because they can check kings and manage practical matters, and this is one of the subtle strengths of Spartan governance. It creates a sense that the city is not controlled by one unpredictable ruler, but by a system that rewards stability and continuity. And while Sparta is famous for discipline, it is also famous for something quieter, something that does not look dramatic on a battlefield, but is dramatic in daily life, the Spartan idea of emotional control, the idea that you do not show fear easily, you do not show weakness easily, you do not collapse under pressure, and this mindset becomes a kind of training of the soul, not just of the body. This affects the way Spartans speak, and the way they raise children, and the way they treat hardship as normal, not as tragedy, and in this atmosphere, the concept of endurance becomes almost sacred, because endurance keeps the line unbroken, endurance keeps the community stable, endurance keeps fear from spreading. Spartan boys are trained in ways that make them aware of cold nights and hunger, and they learn to move efficiently, to obey quickly, to cooperate without confusion, and while outsiders sometimes describe these practices with exaggerated stories, the core truth remains that Sparta creates a society where military readiness is deeply linked to citizenship, and where citizenship is deeply linked to a particular way of living. But we must remember that Sparta is not only men training, Sparta is also families, and women, and older people, and daily work happening in the background, and Spartan women in particular have a distinctive place compared to many other Greek societies, because Sparta expects women to be strong and healthy, expects them to manage households and property when men are away, expects them to participate in a culture where physical fitness is respected, and this creates a social role that can appear unusual when compared to places like Athens, where women's public role is more restricted. Spartan women are often described in sources as having more freedom of movement, more control over property, and more direct speech, and whether every detail is perfectly accurate in every era is debated, but the broad pattern is that Sparta's social structure, shaped by the long-term focus on military life for men, creates space for women to manage practical life with more independence than in some other cities. In Sparta, the home is connected to the state, and personal life is always under the shadow of public expectation, so even relationships, even marriage, even family structure, often appears shaped by the idea that the city's survival comes first, and that the next generation must be raised to continue the pattern. And so, the Spartan citizen grows inside a community that feels like a constant training ground, a place where the city itself is the teacher, where routine is the lesson, and where identity is reinforced by repetition, by shared meals, by shared hardships, by shared discipline. When a Spartan reaches adulthood, he is not simply free, he is committed, he must remain part of the syssitia, he must contribute to the common meals, he must maintain the expectations of readiness, and even as he ages, he remains part of the system, and in later life, if he is respected and selected, he might join the council of elders, becoming one of the voices that guide the city with tradition-heavy wisdom. And throughout all of this, Sparta's greatest strength is its unity, but its greatest weakness is also its rigidity, because a system built for stability can become slow to adapt, and a society that fears internal change might struggle when the world outside shifts in unpredictable ways. Yet in the archaic and early classical periods, Sparta's reputation grows, not because it produces endless poets or philosophers, but because it produces what other cities recognize as power, disciplined power, reliable power, the kind of power that can hold ground in conflict and remain organized in crisis. Sparta also builds a network of alliances, and it becomes a leading force within the Peloponnese, developing influence through leadership and pressure, because smaller cities often prefer to align with a strong stable neighbor rather than stand alone against rivals. And while Sparta is becoming this disciplined land power, another story is beginning to rise in a different direction, the story of Athens, a city that will become famous for debate, for law, for naval strength, and for cultural innovation, and the contrast between these two cities will eventually become one of the most important tensions in Greek history. But before we step toward Athens, it is important to let Sparta remain in our mind as a shape of control and endurance, a society that tries to solve the problem of survival through discipline, through unity, and through the reduction of personal softness, a society that believes a city is strongest when its citizens think like one body, and when private desire is trained to obey public necessity. So imagine Sparta again, not as a loud place, but as a quiet place, where mornings begin with routine, where the air smells of earth and sweat and simple food, where conversation is brief but meaningful, where the city's rhythm is steady like a heartbeat, and where each generation is raised to accept the same rhythm, the same expectations, the same commitment to being part of something larger than themselves. And in that steady rhythm, Sparta becomes what it is known for, a city that does not seek to shine, but seeks to last, a city that does not want to impress, but wants to endure, a city that builds itself not from marble decorations, but from habits carved into human behavior, habits that turn a community into a single living structure, calm on the surface, intense beneath it, always prepared, always controlled, always watching the horizon. Athens does not feel like Sparta. It does not grow into the world as a quiet valley fortress built for endurance and control. It grows like a coastal wind that keeps moving, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong, always bringing something new. And if Sparta is the image of discipline carved into stone, then Athens is the image of conversation carried through streets, and this difference begins not in one sudden moment, but in the geography, the economy, and the habits of everyday life. Athens is located in Attica, a region shaped by hills, rocky ground, and a coastline that opens naturally toward the sea, and because the land is not endlessly fertile, because the soil is often thin, Athens does not become rich simply by growing grain in wide plains. It becomes a place that must balance farming with trade, and in that balance it finds its character, because trade brings strangers, trade brings ideas, trade brings money, and money changes the way power is distributed inside a community. In the early centuries, Athens is still like many other Greek city-states. It is shaped by aristocratic families, noble lineages who own the most land and hold the most prestige, and in many ways this is the natural beginning for a polis, because when communities grow larger, people look for leadership, and the families with wealth and connections often take that role. But aristocratic power has a hidden weakness, because it can create resentment, and resentment can rise quietly until it becomes a crisis. In Athens, the aristocrats, often called the eupatridae, meaning well-born, dominate early political life, and although Athens has kings in the distant past, over time the city shifts toward a system where leadership is shared among officials, archons, and councils, and this creates the appearance of balance, but beneath that appearance the poor can still feel trapped, because laws can be vague, and vague laws often protect those who already have influence. As Athens grows, the tension becomes sharper because of debt, because poor farmers who struggle through bad harvests may borrow from wealthier landowners, and when a farmer cannot repay, the consequences can be severe, sometimes leading to debt bondage, where a person's freedom is limited, where land can be taken, where families can fall into dependence, and when many people experience this, the city becomes unstable, because it is hard to feel loyal to a community that seems to be crushing you. This is the background for one of the most important figures in early Athenian history, Solon, and Solon is not remembered only because he wrote laws, he is remembered because he stepped into a society on the edge of conflict and attempted to reshape it with reforms that could calm both sides, and when we imagine Solon, we should not imagine a magician who fixes everything instantly. We should imagine a careful man walking through a crowded city, listening to complaints, observing anger, sensing the danger of civil strife, and realizing that if nothing changes, the polis could destroy itself from within. Solon's reforms are often described as a kind of shaking off burdens, a cancellation of certain debts and the freeing of people who had fallen into forms of bondage, and this matters because it restores a sense of dignity to citizens who had been pushed toward despair, but at the same time, Solon does not simply punish the aristocrats, he tries to create a system that still respects property and stability. Because Athens needs wealthy citizens too, it needs resources, it needs leadership, and it needs balance, and so his reforms become an attempt to create a middle path. One of the most significant elements of Solon's program is how he reorganizes political participation, because instead of basing political power entirely on birth, Athens begins to place more emphasis on wealth classes, measured by agricultural output, and this is not democracy in the modern sense, but it is a move away from pure aristocratic birthright. It is a move that says influence can be earned through contribution, through capacity, and through the ability to support the city. Solon also creates institutions that expand the sense of civic involvement, such as a council that prepares matters for decision, and courts that allow citizens to appeal, and this is crucial because when citizens feel they can bring grievances into a structured system, they are less likely to bring them into the streets as violence, and the idea of law becomes stronger, not as a tool of the powerful only, but as a framework the whole community can recognize. Yet even though Solon's reforms reduce immediate pressure, they do not remove all tension, because social conflict is rarely solved in one generation, and Athens continues to struggle with factions, with rival groups pulling in different directions, and this opens the door for a different kind of ruler to appear, the tyrant, and in Greek history, tyranny does not always mean cruelty in the modern sense. It often means a single strong leader who takes control outside traditional aristocratic structures, sometimes with popular support, sometimes by force, and often because people are tired of instability. In Athens, the most famous tyrant family is connected to Pisistratus, a man who gains power through political skill, alliances, and a careful reading of the city's needs, and under Pisistratus and his sons, Athens experiences development, building projects, cultural support, and a strengthening of the city as a center, and this creates another paradox of history, that even a tyrant can produce stability and growth, Even a ruler outside traditional law can sometimes create conditions that later support democracy. Pisistratus supports festivals, promotes certain religious and cultural events, and strengthens Athens as a community that sees itself as special, and this matters because cultural identity can unify people even when politics is uncertain, and the more Athens becomes culturally confident, the more it becomes ready to imagine a new political identity as well. But tyranny does not last forever, and when the tyrant system collapses, Athens returns to a struggle between factions, and here another name becomes central, Cleisthenes, a reformer who reshapes the political organization of Athens in a way that will become one of the foundations of what we later call democracy. Cleisthenes' genius is not only in writing laws, but in reorganizing the social map of the city, because Athens has long been shaped by family groups and local loyalties, powerful clans that can dominate politics through patronage, and Cleisthenes tries to weaken that old structure by changing how citizens are grouped, shifting the basis of political identity away from family and toward broader civic units. He divides Attica into new tribes based on geographical units that mix different regions together, city, coast, inland, and by mixing them, he makes it harder for one noble family to control a tribe completely, and this has a deeply democratic effect, because it encourages citizens to cooperate across older boundaries. It encourages political identity to become civic rather than purely familial. With these reforms, Athens builds institutions that allow broader citizen participation, such as the Council of 500, chosen from the tribes, preparing business for the assembly, and the assembly itself becomes a more significant place where citizens can vote on decisions. And again, this is not democracy for everyone. Women, slaves, and foreigners are excluded, but among male citizens, the space for political voice becomes far wider than it had been. Athens also develops a culture of debate, because when a city's decisions depend on assemblies and courts, the ability to speak becomes power, the ability to persuade becomes influence, and over time this produces a new type of leader, not only the warrior aristocrat, but the skilled speaker, the organizer, the strategist of public opinion. And while this may sound like a purely political change, it reshapes daily life, because when citizens believe their voices matter, they look at the city differently, they see themselves as part of the city's mind, and this creates a kind of energy, the feeling that Athens is not only a place you live, but a place you build through argument, through voting, through participation. Athens, like Sparta, still has religion at its core, still honors gods and festivals, but in Athens the festivals become even more visible, more elaborate, and often connected to civic pride. The Panathenaic festival honoring Athena, the city's goddess, becomes a symbol of Athenian identity, and you can imagine the streets filling slowly with people, the sound of footsteps, the steady rhythm of processions, the smell of offerings, the sense of a whole community moving together through sacred tradition. And Athens becomes a place of craftsmanship, pottery workshops, markets, shipbuilders, metalworkers, and as trade grows, Athens gains resources, and as resources grow, Athens can build a navy, and a navy changes everything, because a navy requires large numbers of rowers, ordinary citizens, and when ordinary citizens become essential to military power, political pressure increases for their voices to be respected. This connection between naval power and democracy becomes one of the key stories of Athens, because the city's future strength will rely not only on aristocratic hoplites, but on the masses who can row ships across the sea, and this creates a political reality that cannot be ignored. In this way, Athens slowly becomes the opposite of Sparta's model. Sparta builds unity through strict training and controlled equality among a small citizen warrior class. Athens builds unity through participation, debate, reform, and the integration of a larger citizen body into civic life, and neither model is perfect, because each model has costs. Sparta's rigidity can create limitations. Athens' openness can create instability, but together they represent two paths in the same landscape. Two experiments in how a city might survive and grow. And all of this is happening before the famous storm arrives, before the Persian Empire steps into the Greek world like a great shadow on the horizon, before Marathon and Thermopylae become names repeated through centuries. And it is important to feel that calm before the storm, because the reforms of Athens, the discipline of Sparta, the rivalries of city-states, the alliances and jealousies, all of these will shape how Greece responds when it faces a threat that is larger than any one polis. So imagine Athens at dawn, the city waking slowly, the marketplace beginning to fill, craftsmen opening doors, farmers arriving from the countryside, voices carrying through narrow streets, and above them, on the Acropolis, the sacred rock, the place where gods are honored and the city's identity feels ancient and protected, and in the distance you can sense the sea, the open road of ships and trade and possibility. And you can feel why Athens becomes what it becomes, why it learns to trust. Movement, discussion, reform, and civic energy. Because Athens is not a city that stays still, it is a city that speaks, it is a city that debates, it is a city that changes, and in that constant motion it builds the foundations of an idea that will echo far beyond its own time, the idea that citizens can shape their own government, imperfectly, slowly, through conflict and compromise, through voices rising and falling like waves. And now, with Sparta disciplined and Athens awakened, the Greek world stands ready for the next chapter, the moment when rivalry becomes alliance, when fear becomes courage, and when the city-states face something larger than themselves. There are moments in history that feel like a distant thunder, not because people suddenly wake up and decide that everything will change, but because the world quietly shifts in the background, and then one day the shift becomes impossible to ignore, and for the Greek city-states, the Persian Wars are that moment, not a single battle, not a single day, but a long approach of pressure, like a cloud moving over the sea, growing darker not because the sun disappears, but because something enormous is crossing the horizon. To understand why the Persian Wars happen, we need to breathe slowly and widen the map in our minds, because Greece is not alone in the ancient world. Greece is a patchwork of city-states, proud and stubborn and competitive, but beyond them, to the east, there is an empire that is simply larger in scale, larger in resources, larger in organization, an empire that stretches across many lands, many languages, many climates, and many roads, and that empire is Persia, a power that does not think in terms of one valley or one harbor, but in terms of entire regions, entire coastlines, and entire systems of control. The Persian Empire grows quickly under rulers like Cyrus the Great, expanding with a combination of military force, political strategy, and administrative structure, and later under Darius, it becomes even more organized, more stable, more capable of moving armies and supplies across great distances. And to the Persians, the Greek world is not a mystical collection of heroic cities, it is a coastal region, a set of small communities, sometimes useful, sometimes annoying, sometimes profitable. And the Persian goal, like most imperial goals, is not necessarily to destroy everything in fire, but to bring everything into a stable orbit of control. And one of the most important crossroads between Greece and Persia is not even on the Greek mainland at first, it is along the coast of Anatolia, where many Greek-speaking cities exist, cities often called Ionian Greek cities, places like Miletus and others, communities that speak Greek and share Greek culture but exist within the Persian sphere, and for years these cities live under Persian influence, paying tribute, accepting Persian-appointed local rulers, living in a tense balance where trade can continue but political independence is limited. And tension grows slowly, because when people feel their identity is being managed by someone far away, the idea of rebellion becomes tempting, especially when local elites feel they are losing power, and when ordinary people feel burdened by demands and tribute, and so the Ionian revolt begins, not as a perfectly unified freedom movement, but as a complicated surge of resistance, mixed with local politics, mixed with ambition, mixed with frustration, and in that revolt the Greek mainland becomes connected to the conflict, because Athens and Eretria send support, and even if the support is limited, even if the scale is small compared to Persia's power, it matters symbolically. In the mind of an empire, symbolic defiance can be remembered like a small cut that still stings, and for Darius, the idea that Athens helped rebellious cities becomes a reason to pay attention, not because Athens is the greatest city in the world, but because Athens has stepped into a larger story, and the empire begins to look toward the Greek mainland with a more focused interest. The first Persian expedition against Greece becomes connected to this desire to punish, to control, and to expand influence, and the Greek world, which is usually busy arguing with itself, suddenly feels a different kind of fear, because one city-state can fight another city-state and still feel like the conflict is local, but an empire feels different, an empire feels like weather, something that is not impressed by pride. Something that does not negotiate with smallness, something that moves forward because it can. Athens, in this period, is still becoming itself, still shaping its political identity, still building the confidence of a citizen body that has begun to participate more actively in governance, and Sparta is still holding its disciplined position as a land power, careful and controlled, and other city-states watch everything with the practical caution of neighbors who have seen wars before. When the Persians arrive in Greece in the first major phase, the story leads us to one of the most famous names in the history of distance and endurance, Marathon, and Marathon is not a mythological stage, it is a real place, a plain near the sea, where land opens enough for armies to stand, where hills rise around the edges, where the coastline breathes salt air, and the atmosphere of that place matters. Because geography always matters in ancient war, armies move at the speed of feet, and what a plain looks like can decide what a leader dares to attempt. The Persian force lands, and the Athenians face an urgent decision, because Athens is not surrounded by endless allies ready to appear instantly, and the city must decide whether to wait behind walls, whether to negotiate, whether to attack, whether to trust its own soldiers, and the Athenian army is based on hoplites, citizens with armor, shields, spears, men who are farmers and craftsmen and traders in normal life, but now standing in formation because the polis requires it. Sparta is asked for help, but Sparta is slow to move, partly because of religious festivals and rules that affect Spartan timing, and also because Sparta's decision-making is cautious, and so Athens stands close to being alone, with only limited allies, like Plataea, and this creates a special pressure, because when a city fights without the full weight of Greece behind it, the battle becomes not only a military moment but a test of identity. The Athenians choose to engage, and the Battle of Marathon becomes a clash between different styles of warfare. The Persian army includes many troops, archers, and a range of units drawn from across an empire, and the Greek hoplites are heavier, tighter in formation, built for pushing and holding ground, and the outcome becomes one of the great surprises of the era, because the Athenians win. And in that victory the Greek world sees something important, that Persia is powerful, yes, but not invincible, and that a disciplined citizen army can hold against the weight of imperial resources if the conditions are right. And this victory creates a kind of psychological transformation, because fear does not disappear, but confidence becomes possible, and Athens begins to understand that its survival may depend not only on courage but on preparation, and the years after Marathon are filled with that quiet preparation, with arguments and politics and planning, because in history the space between wars is often just as important as the wars themselves. In Athens, one of the most important developments is naval power, because a city that opens to the sea can protect itself by controlling water, and here a figure like Themistocles becomes significant, because he pushes Athens toward building a stronger fleet, using resources like the silver mines at Laurium, and this is not a small decision. Building triremes, the fast warships of the age, is expensive. It requires wood, labor, planning, and most importantly it requires people, rowers. Thousands of them, ordinary citizens whose muscles become the engine of the city's defense. This is one of those hidden links between warfare and politics, because when the lower classes become essential to military success, their political importance grows, and Athens' democratic development becomes tied to the sea, tied to the idea that the city's power is not only the shield wall of hoplites, but the synchronized movement of rowers pulling through waves in a steady rhythm. And while Athens is preparing, Persia is not forgetting, because empires do not like unfinished business, and after Darius comes Xerxes, and Xerxes prepares a second expedition, larger, more dramatic, more carefully organized, an event that ancient writers describe with awe, and when we read those descriptions we should keep our minds calm, because ancient sources often exaggerate numbers, but the essential truth remains. This is a massive effort, a gathering of resources on an imperial scale. An attempt not simply to punish but to bring Greece firmly into Persian control. As Xerxes moves toward Greece, the Greek city-states face the difficult problem they always face, unity, because Greek identity is shared, but Greek politics are divided, and many city-states do not want to obey Athens, and many do not trust Sparta, and yet the Persian threat forces a kind of cooperation, because the alternative is submission, and so alliances form. And in this alliance Sparta often takes leadership on land, because Sparta is respected for its discipline, and Athens becomes crucial at sea, because Athens has the fleet, and this partnership, uneasy and proud on both sides, becomes the backbone of resistance. Now the story moves into one of the most famous passages in ancient history, Thermopylae, and Thermopylae is a place where the land narrows, where mountains press close, where the road becomes tight, where a smaller force can hold a larger one for a time, and this is why Thermopylae becomes a symbol, because geography turns into strategy, and strategy turns into legend. At Thermopylae, Greek forces under Spartan leadership take position, and among them is the Spartan king Leonidas, and the goal is not necessarily to win forever, because no position holds forever if the enemy can find a way around it. The goal is to delay, to slow the Persian advance, to buy time for Greece to prepare, to keep the road blocked as long as possible. The atmosphere of Thermopylae is important for the mood of the story, because it is a place of heat and narrowness, a place where the air feels trapped, where footsteps echo between stone and slope, where the sea is near but not comforting, and the Greeks stand there knowing they face something immense, and they hold because holding is what hoplites are trained to do, shield against shield, line against line, discipline against pressure. The battle becomes famous not because it is the final victory, but because it is a demonstration of resistance, and eventually the Persians find a way around the pass, and the Greeks cannot hold indefinitely, and in the end the story becomes one of sacrifice and delay, and the significance is not simply romantic, it is practical, because time is a weapon, and Thermopylae buys time. At the same time, while Thermopylae is happening on land, there are also naval actions in nearby waters, like Artemisium, and these battles show the importance of the sea, because Greece cannot survive only by holding roads. Greece must also protect its coastlines, protect its supply movement, and prevent the Persian navy from freely controlling the Aegean. As Persia continues advancing, Athens faces one of the hardest moments in its history, evacuation, because Athens cannot hold the city itself against a massive army without risking total destruction, and so the people are moved, the city is left behind, and this moment is painful not only for politics but for identity, because when you leave your home to save your future, you are choosing survival over pride. And the empty streets become a kind of silent proof that war is not only about soldiers, it is about families, temples, and memory. And yet Athens does not surrender, because Athens' real strength now is its fleet, and that fleet becomes the center of the next major turning point, Salamis. Salamis is not simply a battle, it is a space, a narrow stretch of water, islands and coastlines forming a channel where movement is restricted, and again, geography becomes strategy, because in open water the Persian fleet's numbers might matter more, but in narrow water, Greek ships can fight in a more controlled environment, and Themistocles, using both planning and psychological pressure, pushes the conflict toward this narrow place. The Battle of Salamis becomes a decisive moment because it demonstrates that a smaller, well-handled fleet can defeat a larger force if the conditions support discipline, coordination, and knowledge of the local waters, and when the Greek fleet wins at Salamis, the entire direction of the war shifts, because Persian supply and movement become more complicated, and Xerxes cannot simply sweep through Greece like a storm that cannot be stopped. After Salamis, Persia still remains powerful, still dangerous, still present, but the image of unstoppable advance is broken, and now the Greek alliance has space to breathe, space to gather, space to prepare for the next phase, because wars are often decided not by one heroic moment, but by the accumulation of moments, by the steady wearing down of pressure. The final major land confrontation often remembered is Plataea, where Greek forces meet Persian forces in a large battle that contributes to the end of the invasion, and around the same time there are actions like Mycale in the east, showing that the conflict spreads across multiple fronts, and gradually the Persian attempt to dominate Greece directly begins to retreat, not because Persia collapses as an empire, but because the cost and complexity of controlling Greece becomes too high compared to the benefits. And when we step back and look at the Persian wars as a whole, the most important outcome is not only military, it is psychological and political, because Greece has survived, and survival creates confidence, and confidence creates ambition, and ambition creates rivalry. Athens emerges from the war with enormous prestige, especially because of its naval power, and because of the role ordinary rowers played. Athenian democracy becomes stronger, the city becomes richer through alliances and tribute systems, and Athens begins to build temples, walls, cultural projects, institutions that make it look like the shining center of Greek civilization. And this is the beginning of the Athenian Golden Age. Sparta, meanwhile, retains its reputation, especially as the defender of Greek land power and discipline, but Sparta is cautious about Athens' growth, and other city-states watch with mixed feelings, because a united Greece against Persia is one thing, but a powerful Athens leading an alliance is another thing, and power always creates friction among equals. So the Persian wars do not end the story with peace and harmony, they end the story with a new kind of tension. Because once the external danger fades, internal competition returns, and now it returns. On a larger scale, with Athens wealthier and more confident, with Sparta wary and proud, and with the Greek world slowly moving toward the next great conflict, the one that will consume the energy of the city-states in a long exhausting struggle, the Peloponnesian War. And if you imagine the Aegean after the Persian Wars, you can picture quiet waters at sunset, ships moving slowly between islands, the sound of wood creaking, oars dipping, the distant glow of lamps in coastal towns, and beneath that calm surface, politics is still moving, alliances are shifting, old friendships are becoming suspicious, and the same questions return: who leads, who follows, who controls trade, who controls security, who decides what freedom means. Because Greece has survived a storm from the east, but now it must face a storm that grows from inside its own rivalries, and that storm is already forming, quietly, slowly. Like clouds gathering again after the Persian Wars, the Greek world does not immediately relax into perfect peace, because history rarely gives a clean ending, but there is a shift in the air, a shift in confidence, and for Athens especially, that confidence becomes the foundation of a remarkable transformation, because Athens has not only survived, it has discovered what it can become, and when a city discovers its potential, it begins to expand that potential into stone, into ships, into laws, into art, and into the everyday habits of thousands of people who suddenly feel that their city is more than just a home, it is a living idea. Athens grows into what later generations will call a golden age, but a golden age is not gold in the sense of being flawless, it is gold in the sense of shining, visible, influential, and impossible to ignore, and behind that shine is a mixture of energy and tension, because Athens becomes stronger through the sea, through alliances, through tribute, through the constant movement of ships, and at the center of this growing Athenian world we find a name that echoes through centuries: Pericles. Pericles is not a king, and he does not rule Athens as a tyrant, he is a political leader in a democracy, which means his power depends on persuasion, on reputation, and on the approval of citizens, and that makes him a different kind of ruler than the monarchs of great empires, because he must constantly perform the act of leadership in public. He must be convincing, he must be strategic, he must understand the emotions of the assembly, the fears of ordinary citizens, the ambitions of rivals, and the delicate balance between boldness and caution. In many ways, Pericles becomes the face of Athens at its most confident, a leader who believes the city can shape the world around it, not through conquest like an empire of cavalry and roads, but through naval strength, cultural prestige, and political organization. And under his influence Athens builds not only ships and walls, but also monuments, festivals, and institutions that make the city feel like the center of something larger than itself. To understand why Athens becomes so powerful, we have to return again to the sea, because Athens is not the strongest land power in Greece. Sparta remains formidable on land, but Athens can project strength through water, and in the ancient world, sea power means trade, mobility, and control of islands and coastlines. And this is where the Delian League becomes crucial. The Delian League begins as an alliance against Persia, a coalition of city-states that want continued security, and Athens is a natural leader because it has ships, experience, and organization, and for many members, paying tribute to Athens seems reasonable, a way to fund a shared defense. But over time, the League changes, because alliances often evolve into structures of dominance. And Athens begins to use the League's resources not only for shared protection but also for its own projects, its own security, its own ambitions. The League's treasury, originally associated with the island of Delos, eventually becomes closely tied to Athens itself, and this shift is significant, because it symbolizes a change from shared alliance to Athenian-centered power, and many city-states begin to feel that Athens is not only a protector but also a supervisor, a city that expects obedience, a city that treats dissent as disloyalty. Yet within Athens, many citizens experience this period as one of prosperity, employment, and pride. Because when tribute flows and naval power expands, the city becomes busy. Building projects require workers, craftsmen find customers, traders find markets, and the urban life becomes more intense, more complex, more energized. Now imagine Athens in this golden age, not as a frozen picture of marble ruins, but as a living city full of sound and movement, with narrow streets winding between houses, with sunlight reflecting off pale stone, with dust rising gently from the feet of people walking to the agora, the marketplace, and as you approach the agora you can hear the slow hum of many voices at once, merchants calling quietly, buyers bargaining, philosophers talking, politicians gathering supporters, foreigners speaking in unfamiliar accents, and citizens moving with a sense that public life is not optional. It is part of identity. The agora is more than a market, it is the heart of public life. A place where you can buy olives and bread, yes, but also a place where you hear news, where you listen to arguments, where you watch trials, where you see public announcements. And in a democracy, information is power, because citizens must decide, and deciding requires awareness. And so the city becomes a space where listening becomes a civic skill. One of the most dramatic symbols of Athens' golden age rises above the city, the Acropolis, the sacred rock. And in earlier times the Acropolis is already important as a religious center, but now, under Pericles and the cultural ambitions of the city, it becomes a stage of stone and meaning, because Athens begins to rebuild and expand its sacred architecture, creating structures that will later define the visual memory of Greece. The Parthenon becomes the most famous of these buildings, dedicated to Athena, the city's patron goddess, and it is not only a religious temple, it is a statement, a public message carved into marble, saying that Athens has resources, organization, artistic skill, and confidence, and even the way it is designed, with careful proportions and refined details, expresses the idea that beauty can be controlled, that order can be aesthetic, and that human creativity can stand beside divine honor. But beyond the Parthenon, there are other buildings and sculptures, there are ceremonies and festivals, And the city's religion becomes woven into civic identity so deeply that political life and sacred life often feel inseparable, because when the city prospers, the gods must be thanked, and when the city faces danger, the gods must be consulted, and when the city builds great monuments, the monuments themselves become offerings as well as declarations. In this period, Athens also becomes famous for its theater, and theater in Athens is not only entertainment, it is education and civic reflection, because plays explore themes of justice, power, fate, pride, and human suffering, and citizens gather in large numbers to watch tragedies and comedies, to laugh, to mourn, to think about their society through stories, and this creates a culture where public art becomes part of public thought. Imagine the theater of Dionysus, carved into the slope near the Acropolis, with rows of seats filled with citizens, and the sun moving slowly across the sky as a play begins, and the actors' voices carry outward, and the chorus speaks in rhythm, and the audience listens, not quietly like a modern cinema, but with presence, with reaction, with emotion, because the theater is a collective experience, a moment where Athens watches itself. And beyond the theater, Athens becomes a place where philosophy begins to bloom in public spaces, not as distant academic work, but as conversation, because in a city that values debate, questioning becomes normal, and people like Socrates walk through public areas asking difficult questions, testing assumptions, challenging confidence. And this habit of questioning becomes part of the city's intellectual atmosphere, an atmosphere that later generations will remember as the birth of a certain style of thinking. At the same time, daily life continues in simple ways, because a golden age is built on ordinary routines. The morning begins with households waking, water being carried, bread being prepared, children being guided through streets, craftsmen opening workshops, and you can imagine a potter's workshop where clay is shaped, where a wheel spins, where hands move with practiced calm, creating vessels that will travel not only across Attica but across the sea, carrying Athenian style into distant markets. In Athens, citizenship is central, but citizenship is also limited, because not everyone participates equally. Women, slaves, and resident foreigners do not have the same political rights as male citizens, and this is one of the great contradictions of Athenian democracy, that it is both innovative and exclusive at the same time. And understanding Athens requires holding both truths gently, without simplifying them. Because Athens is not a modern moral ideal, it is an ancient experiment, brilliant in some ways, flawed in others. Women in Athens often live more private lives than Spartan women, with social expectations that keep them mostly within household boundaries. And while their role is essential in managing families and domestic life, their political voice is restricted, and yet their presence is still fundamental. Because households are the foundation of the city, and without families, the polis cannot continue. Slavery is also present, and enslaved people perform labor that supports the economy, and this again reveals the deep complexity of the city. Because Athens celebrates freedom and civic participation among citizens, but it also relies on systems that deny freedom to others, and these contradictions are part of why history is never simple. Resident foreigners, the metics, are also important, because Athens is a trading city, and merchants, craftsmen, and workers from other regions live there, contributing to economic life, paying taxes, serving in certain roles, yet not having full citizenship, and this creates a layered society where identity and rights vary depending on status. Meanwhile, the political system remains active and demanding, because Athens makes decisions constantly, about war, about alliances, about building projects, about law, and citizens gather in the assembly to vote, and in the law courts to judge, and this means that politics is not distant. Politics is something ordinary citizens experience as a normal part of life. A citizen might spend one day working in a workshop, another day serving on a jury, another day rowing in a ship, and this blending of daily work and civic duty creates a unique kind of citizen identity, the sense that you belong to the city not only emotionally, but practically, through service and participation. Now imagine a day in Athens during the height of this golden age, a day that begins with mild sunlight. People moving toward the agora, news spreading through conversation, and somewhere on the Nix hill, citizens gathering for an assembly meeting, men standing and listening, some arguing, some clapping, some skeptical, because democracy is not calm agreement, democracy is managed disagreement, a way to turn conflict into structured decision rather than chaos. And Pericles, as a leader, understands the importance of public mood. He understands that the city is like a ship that must be steered through waves of opinion, and he supports policies that strengthen Athens' defenses, like building the long walls that connect Athens to its port, Piraeus, creating a secure corridor so that even if enemies invade Attica, Athens can still access the sea, still receive supplies, still maintain its naval power. The long walls are not just stone, they are strategy. They represent the Athenian belief that the sea is its lifeline, and this strategy will later shape the city's choices in war, because Athens can choose to avoid open land battles where Sparta excels, and instead rely on naval raids, supplies by sea, and the safety of its walls. And this is where the Golden Age reveals its fragile side, because growth and power create rivals, and Sparta watches Athens with increasing suspicion, and other city-states, especially those forced into Athens' alliance, feel resentment, and the Greek world becomes divided into two spheres, an Athenian sea empire and a Spartan-led land alliance, and this division is like a tension wire stretched tighter each year. Within Athens, people might still feel the excitement of festivals, the pride of monuments, the steady work of trade, the energy of public life, but beneath the surface there is always the knowledge that conflict might return, that war between Greeks is never far away, because Greek city-states are proud and competitive, and power shifts create fear. Yet in the moment, Athens shines, and the city's self-image becomes almost poetic. Athens sees itself as a teacher, a leader, a model, a city where citizens are not only strong but cultured, where life is not only survival but also beauty and thought, and Pericles himself articulates this pride in speeches that later writers preserve, describing Athens as a place that combines courage with refinement. But even while Athens builds temples and holds festivals, the city also maintains a constant readiness. Ships must be maintained, rowers must be available, alliances must be managed, tribute must be collected, and the system that supports the Golden Age is not purely peaceful, it is supported by power, and power always has a cost. The Golden Age, then, is like a bright afternoon that feels endless while it lasts, sunlight on marble, laughter in marketplaces, dramatic performances in theaters, debates on hillsides, ships in the harbor, and the feeling of a city that believes it is shaping history. But as with all bright afternoons, the shadows lengthen slowly, almost unnoticed at first, because as Athens rises, the conditions for the next great struggle are also forming. And if you stand on the Acropolis in your imagination, looking out across Attica, seeing the city spread below, the distant sea shining, the roads running outward, you can sense both pride and vulnerability, because the same openness that gives Athens strength also exposes it to danger, and the same confidence that builds monuments can also tempt the city into overreach. And the next chapter, the one that will test Athens and Sparta more than any Persian invasion ever did, is the long exhausting internal conflict known as the Peloponnesian War, a war not between an empire and a small coalition, but between Greeks themselves, between rival visions of power, between sea and land, between democracy and disciplined oligarchy, between two cities that cannot easily accept the other's dominance. So as Athens shines in its golden age, we can already feel the slow approach of tension, not as panic, but as pressure, pressure in alliances, pressure in fear, pressure in pride, and history moves forward, calmly, steadily, as if it has all the time in the world. A war between Greeks is not like a war against a distant empire, because when the enemy speaks your language, worships the same gods, and lives in cities built from the same kind of stone, the conflict feels more personal, more familiar, and also more tragic, and the Peloponnesian War becomes exactly that kind of conflict, not a single explosive event, but a slow grinding struggle, a long wave of tension that rises and falls for decades, wearing down cities not only with battles, but with fear, fatigue, and the gradual collapse of trust. After the Persian Wars, Greece is not one happy united family. Greece is still a collection of proud city-states, and once the external danger from Persia becomes less immediate, internal rivalries return to the center, because power does not like to sit quietly, power wants to expand, power wants to be respected, and Athens, with its naval strength and alliance system, begins to grow into something that looks like a sea empire, while Sparta, strong on land and respected for discipline, watches this growth with deep caution. Athens is not only protecting allies, it is collecting tribute, controlling ships, influencing politics in other cities, and in many places, what began as voluntary alliance starts to feel like obligation, and when a city-state feels trapped inside someone else's system, it begins to look for escape, and when it looks for escape, it looks for a protector, and Sparta becomes the obvious protector. Not because Sparta is gentle, but because Sparta represents a counterweight to Athenian dominance. So the Greek world divides into two main gravitational centers, Athens leading its maritime coalition, often connected to the Delian League, and Sparta leading its land-based coalition, often connected to the Peloponnesian League, and the balance between these two camps becomes tense, because neither side wants to surrender prestige, and neither side trusts the other to stop growing. It is important to understand the emotional logic of this tension, because Athens believes it has earned leadership through sacrifice against Persia, through naval power, through organization, and it believes its system brings stability, but Sparta fears that Athens' influence will destabilize the entire Greek world, because Athens supports democratic factions and changes local politics. And Sparta's own identity depends on control and stability, especially within its region, and Sparta does not want the sea empire to reach too far into the land. There are also specific sparks that make this tension hotter, disputes involving cities like Corinth, conflicts involving Corcyra, trade disputes, alliances shifting, complaints rising, and these events are like dry grass in summer, because when the air is already warm with suspicion, even a small flame can spread. Eventually, the war begins, and historians often connect its formal beginning to around 431 BCE, but it is better to think of it not as one day war started, but as a pressure system finally became too heavy to hold, and once that happens, the Greek world enters a long season of conflict where no victory is clean and no peace feels permanent. Athens and Sparta enter the war with very different strengths, and this difference shapes the rhythm of everything that follows. Sparta is powerful on land, it has one of the most disciplined hoplite forces, it can invade territories, it can pressure farmland, it can threaten cities without relying on the sea. While Athens is powerful at sea, it has triremes, experienced rowers, and the ability to move resources quickly across water, and Athens also has walls and a city designed to survive. Behind defenses, especially with the long walls that connect it to the port of Piraeus, meaning Athens can remain supplied even when land around it is threatened. This creates two strategies that feel almost like two different philosophies of survival. Sparta's strategy is often direct: invade Attica, burn crops, pressure Athens to come out and fight on land, force a decisive battle where Spartan hoplites can win, while Athens, under leaders like Pericles, chooses a defensive strategy, avoiding major land battles, staying behind walls, relying on sea power, raiding the enemy coastline, and trusting that time and resources will eventually wear Sparta down. And here we meet Pericles again, not as the builder of temples now, but as the strategist of endurance, because he understands that Athens does not need to win one dramatic land battle to win the war. Athens needs to avoid losing its fleet, avoid panic, and keep its alliance network strong, and so Pericles encourages Athenians to accept short-term discomfort, to watch their farmland be destroyed without rushing into the trap of a land battle, to stay patient, and to trust the long-term strength of the city. But patience is not easy, and war is not only strategy on paper, or is people forced into hard choices, and when Sparta invades Attica, many Athenians from rural areas move inside the city walls for safety, and Athens becomes crowded, tense, and psychologically strained, because a city designed for a certain population suddenly must hold many more, and while the walls protect against direct assault, they cannot protect against every kind of suffering. During this period, Athens experiences one of the most devastating events of the war, a plague, a sickness that spreads in crowded conditions, and this is where the war becomes deeply unfair, because no amount of courage or planning can simply command disease to stop, and many Athenians die, including Pericles himself, and the loss is not only personal, it is political, because Pericles represents stability and strategic clarity, and when he is gone, Athens becomes more vulnerable to shifting public moods, ambitious leaders, and more aggressive decisions. The plague also changes the emotional tone of Athens, because when a community suffers unexpected loss, its confidence becomes fragile, and the strain of war, combined with internal grief and uncertainty, makes political arguments sharper, and when fear rises, people often become less patient, less willing to accept a slow strategy, more tempted by risk, more tempted by boldness. Meanwhile, the war continues as a pattern of invasions, raids, counter-raids, and battles, and over time, new leaders emerge, and new mistakes happen, and the conflict begins to feel like a long heavy door that keeps closing again and again, no matter how many times someone tries to push it open. Sparta's invasions continue, but Athens remains protected behind walls, and Athens uses its fleet to strike where it can, and for a while, it seems like Athens' endurance strategy might actually work, because Sparta cannot easily force a decisive victory without suffering losses and without overextending itself. But wars like this do not remain clean and limited, they spread, they attract new allies, they shift into new theaters, and one of the turning points is when Sparta begins to receive help from Persia, which is one of history's quiet ironies, because earlier Greece fought Persia as a united front, and now Greek factions seek Persian resources to defeat other Greeks, and Persia, always practical, is willing to influence Greece by supporting whoever can keep Greece divided and manageable. As the war continues, Athens also makes strategic decisions that change the conflict, and one of the most famous and emotionally heavy moments is the Mytilenean debate, where Athens argues internally about how to treat a rebellious allied city, and this debate shows the darker side of empire, because controlling allies often requires punishment, and punishment raises moral questions. And those moral questions create tension inside Athens itself, because Athens wants to be seen as a city of freedom, but its power depends on forcing obedience from others. In another brutal episode, the fate of the island of Melos becomes an example of how harsh the logic of war can become, because Athens demands submission, Melos resists, and the situation becomes a cold demonstration of power politics, a reminder that even a culturally brilliant city can act with severe force when it believes its authority is being challenged. Yet the most famous disaster of the Peloponnesian War, the event that feels like the moment where Athens pushes too far into ambition and loses control, is the Sicilian expedition. Sicily is far, a world of its own in the western Mediterranean, with rich cities like Syracuse, and Athens sees Sicily as an opportunity for wealth, for expansion, for cutting Spartan influence, for proving that Athens can win not only defensively but offensively, and this temptation is very human, because when a war lasts many years, people get tired of slow progress, and they begin to crave a decisive victory that will end everything quickly. The Sicilian expedition becomes a massive undertaking, ships, soldiers, supplies, and political speeches filled with hope and confidence, and inside Athens there are arguments about whether this is wise or reckless, and the debate itself reveals something about democracy, because Athens can argue openly, but it can also be persuaded into risk by leaders who promise greatness. One of the key figures associated with this moment is Alcibiades, a brilliant and controversial personality, ambitious, persuasive, unpredictable, and his role adds another layer of drama, because Athens' politics are full of rivalries, accusations, and shifting loyalties, and just as the expedition is beginning, Alcibiades is recalled to face charges, and instead of returning obediently, he defects, eventually offering advice to Sparta, and this kind of defection shows how personal ambition can interact with political instability, creating consequences far beyond one individual life. Meanwhile, the expedition continues without clear unity of command, and the situation in Sicily becomes complicated, because Syracuse resists strongly, the Athenians struggle to secure quick victory, the supply situation becomes difficult, allies shift, and over time the expedition turns from confident plan into exhausting struggle. And in war, exhaustion is deadly, because exhaustion makes mistakes easy, exhaustion makes hope fragile, exhaustion makes coordination weak, and eventually the Sicilian expedition ends in catastrophe for Athens, an enormous loss of ships and men, a loss that is not only military but psychological, because Athens has gambled huge resources and lost. And now the city must continue the war with reduced strength and reduced confidence. When this news reaches Athens, the city's mood changes, because now the war no longer feels like a slow contest Athens can endure patiently. Now it feels like a dangerous path where one wrong step can mean collapse, and enemies sense this weakness, and Sparta becomes bolder. Sparta begins to change its strategy. Instead of simply invading and leaving, Sparta establishes a more permanent presence in Attica by occupying a place called Decelia, and this is extremely damaging to Athens, because it disrupts land routes, it threatens resources, and it places constant pressure close to the city, meaning Athens can no longer treat Spartan invasions as seasonal inconvenience. It becomes a sustained wound. At the same time, Athens faces rebellion within its alliance system, because when Athens looks weaker, allies see opportunity to break free, and when allies break free, tribute and resources decline, and Athens must fight not only Sparta but also the crumbling of its own network. Inside Athens, political tension rises again, because crisis makes people question democracy, and oligarchic factions try to seize control, arguing that democracy has led to reckless decisions, and for a period, Athens experiences internal political upheaval, showing again that the most dangerous enemy for any city can sometimes be instability inside its own walls. Yet even in this weakened state, Athens does not collapse instantly, because the city still has skill, still has naval traditions, and still has citizens capable of resilience, and there are moments where Athens achieves surprising victories, reminding the world that Athens is not a fragile toy, it is a hardened power with deep experience. But as the war approaches its final phase, the balance shifts more clearly, and Sparta's ability to build a fleet with Persian financial support becomes decisive, because once Sparta can fight Athens at sea, Athens' greatest advantage becomes less absolute. The final turning points involve naval battles, long maneuvers, commanders, and the gradual tightening of pressure, and in the end, Athens faces defeat, not because its culture vanishes overnight, but because its military and economic ability to continue the war is broken. The surrender of Athens is heavy with symbolism, because the city that built temples and theaters, the city that debated laws and celebrated public speech, is now forced to accept terms, and the long walls are damaged, and the empire-like alliance system collapses, and Athens experiences a change in political structure under Spartan influence. But the end of the war is not as simple, Sparta wins forever, because victory also has costs, and Sparta struggles to maintain dominance over Greece in the long run, and the Greek world remains unstable, divided, and exhausted, and this exhaustion becomes one of the conditions that will later allow new powers to rise, including Thebes briefly, and later Macedonia, and eventually Alexander's world-changing campaigns. The Peloponnesian War, then, is not only a story of battles, it is a story of a civilization burning its own strength through internal rivalry, a story of how fear and pride can trap communities into decades of destruction, a story of how even the brightest golden age can be followed by a long dim evening. And if you imagine the Aegean after the war, you can picture quieter harbors, fewer confident festivals, ships still moving but under more cautious banners, citizens speaking more carefully, remembering the years of pressure, the years of loss, and the years when Greeks fought Greeks until both sides were weaker than before. Because that is one of the deepest lessons of the Peloponnesian War, that sometimes victory is not truly victory, and sometimes the greatest defeat is the exhaustion that remains even after the fighting stops. When the Peloponnesian War ends, It does not feel like a clean sunrise after a storm, it feels more like a cloudy morning after a long night where nobody truly slept, because the Greek world has spent decades in conflict, decades draining money, men, trust, and patience, and even though one side can claim victory, the deeper truth is that almost everyone is weaker, almost everyone is more suspicious. And almost everyone has learned that the old dream of unity can collapse quickly when pride is strong and fear is louder than reason. Athens, once shining in confidence and naval prestige, now stands in a humble position, forced to accept terms, forced to watch the symbols of its strength being reduced, and for many Athenians, this is not just political defeat, it is emotional disorientation, because Athens has built a public identity around leadership, culture, and democratic pride. And now the city must learn how to exist without the same level of control over the Aegean. Sparta, on the other hand, emerges as the official winner, and for a time, Sparta holds the position of the leading power in Greece. But leadership after a long war is not like leadership after a short victory, because you inherit problems instead of trophies, you inherit fractured alliances, angry cities, economic disruption, and populations that have been trained by war to distrust authority. The Greek world after the war is like a landscape where the fields have been walked over too many times, where the soil is tired, where the roads feel familiar but the travelers are more cautious, and in many places, city-states are struggling not only with external threats but with internal division, because long war encourages factionalism, and factionalism does not disappear just because a treaty is signed. Sparta's victory also reveals Sparta's challenge, because Sparta is strong as a disciplined land power, but it is not naturally designed to manage a wide imperial system like Athens once did, and when Sparta tries to control other city-states, it often relies on methods that feel harsh and direct, such as supporting oligarchic governments, placing garrisons, and installing regimes friendly to Spartan interests. And this quickly creates resentment, because city-states do not like to feel supervised, especially by a power that claims to protect Greek freedom. One of the most famous symbols of Spartan influence over Athens after the war is the oligarchic group known as the 30 Tyrants, a regime installed with Spartan support, and even though tyrant can be a complicated word in Greek history, in this case the period becomes associated with political violence, harsh rule, and social fear, and for Athens, it becomes another trauma layered on top of defeat. But Athens, despite its suffering, still has deep civic energy, and the city eventually restores democratic rule, showing that the identity of Athens is not something that can simply be erased by military defeat, because a culture of political participation, once deeply rooted, has a way of returning, especially when citizens believe it is part of their dignity. Still, Athens is not immediately strong again, because resources are limited, alliances are broken, and the city must rebuild carefully, and as Athens rebuilds, Sparta tries to shape the wider Greek world in its own image, encouraging stability through control, discouraging democratic movements that might align with Athenian influence, and this creates a new tension, because Sparta's dominance begins to look like the very kind of oppressive leadership Sparta once criticized in Athens. And while Sparta is trying to manage Greece, Persia returns to the story quietly, because Persia never truly disappears. Persia remains powerful in the east, and Persian leaders are pragmatic. They understand that a divided Greece is easier to influence than a unified Greece, and so Persia often plays a subtle game, offering money, offering support, encouraging conflict among Greek powers so that none become too strong. This period becomes complicated with shifting treaties and alliances, and one of the most important agreements is often referred to as the King's Peace, or the Peace of Antalcidas, where Persian influence is present in the settlement, and the peace terms reflect a reality that Greece is not fully independent in its diplomacy, because Persia has returned as a power that can shape Greek politics through wealth and strategic leverage. For many Greeks, this is humiliating, because the memory of resisting Persia is still part of Greek pride, and now Persian power is influencing Greek outcomes again, not through invasion, but through negotiation and money, and this is another sign of how exhausted the Greek world has become, because exhaustion makes you accept things you would have rejected in stronger times. Meanwhile, Sparta's dominance faces direct challenges, because other city-states do not want Spartan control to become permanent, and the city of Thebes begins to rise as a serious contender for leadership, and Thebes is not a newcomer, it is an old city with its own traditions and power, but in this period it becomes more active, more ambitious, and more capable of confronting Sparta on the battlefield. The Theban rise is connected to talented leadership and military innovation, especially in the way Thebes uses its hoplite forces, and one of the most famous names connected to this is Epaminondas, a leader whose strategies will shock the Greek world, because he demonstrates that Sparta is not invincible, and when the image of Spartan invincibility breaks, Greek politics change quickly, because many city-states have obeyed Sparta partly out of respect and fear, and when fear is reduced, resistance becomes possible. The Battle of Leuctra is one of the key moments, where Thebes defeats Sparta in a major confrontation, and this battle is not only a military event, it is a symbolic event, because it tells Greece that power can shift again, that Sparta's long dominance is not guaranteed, and the psychological impact spreads outward like ripples in water. After Leuctra, Sparta's influence weakens, and Thebes for a time becomes the leading power in Greece, but Theban dominance also faces limits, because Greece is still fragmented, and maintaining leadership over many cities is difficult, and Thebes does not have the same kind of long-term economic network that Athens once had through the sea, so Theban power, while impressive, is harder to sustain. During this post-war century, Greek city-states experience a kind of political instability that feels constant, alliances form and break, cities seek advantage, leaders rise and fall, and ordinary people live under the pressure of uncertainty, because even if there is no massive war every year, there is always the expectation that conflict could return, that neighbors could become enemies again, that new demands could appear suddenly. And while the Greek world is busy exhausting itself through repeated rivalry, another power is growing on the northern edge of the Greek world, Macedonia. Macedonia in earlier periods is often seen by southern Greeks as rough, less sophisticated, not fully part of the same civilized identity, but that view becomes outdated as Macedonia strengthens politically and militarily, and the key figure in this strengthening is Philip II. Philip II is not simply a king who inherits power and stays comfortable, he is a reformer and organizer, someone who transforms Macedonia into a disciplined military state with an army structure that is highly effective, and Philip learns from Greek warfare while also innovating beyond it, creating a force that can defeat traditional hoplite armies through flexibility, training, and new formations. And while Greek city-states are arguing among themselves, Macedonia is quietly becoming more unified, more stable, and more dangerous, because unity is a weapon, and the Greek city-states, for all their brilliance, struggled to remain unified for long. Philip uses diplomacy, intimidation, alliances, and war to expand Macedonian influence, and slowly the Greek world begins to realize that the next major power shift may not come from Athens or Sparta or Thebes, but from the north, from a kingdom that has learned how to combine Greek military ideas with strong centralized control. This is the deeper pattern of the post-Peloponnesian era, that the Greek city-states, once able to resist a massive empire through cooperation, are now unable to resist a rising northern power because cooperation is fragile and rivalry is constant. Athens tries to recover its influence, it rebuilds some strength, it remains culturally vibrant, it remains intellectually powerful, but it cannot easily restore the empire-like control it once had, and Sparta remains respected but diminished. Thebes rises briefly but cannot hold permanent leadership, and Greece becomes a chessboard where no city can dominate for long without being challenged. So the world after the Peloponnesian War is a world of tired cities, shifting alliances, and repeated struggles for balance, and this tiredness is important, because it shapes what happens next, it creates the conditions for Macedonian domination, and it sets the stage for one of the most dramatic expansions in ancient history, the campaigns of Alexander the Great. But before Alexander's story begins, it is worth lingering in this quiet, unstable period, because it shows something deeply human, that even brilliant societies can damage themselves through internal rivalry, that victory can create new problems, that freedom can become a slogan used by powers who also demand obedience, and that the long-term winners of history are often those who learn stability while others remain trapped in cycles of competition. Imagine Greece in these years, smaller wars and tensions spreading across the land like small fires, citizens hearing rumors of shifting alliances, markets continuing to function but with cautious eyes, soldiers being trained again and again, mothers and fathers fearing the next call to arms, leaders arguing in assemblies, and beyond all of this, in the north, Macedonia growing steadily stronger, patient, organized, watching, waiting. Because history is often decided not by the loudest city, but by the most prepared one, and the post-war Greek world, brilliant but divided, is slowly moving toward a future where division will no longer be a choice, because a new power will impose order from outside. The Greek world after the Peloponnesian War is tired, and the tiredness is not only physical, not only economic, but also mental, because when people spend decades watching alliances break and rebuild, when they see cities argue and fight and negotiate and fight again, they begin to accept instability as normal, they begin to live in a permanent state of careful waiting, as if tomorrow might bring a new enemy, a new treaty, or a new demand, and in such a world, the most dangerous thing is not always the loudest threat, but the quiet power that grows outside the tired system. To the north of the Greek heartlands, beyond the familiar city-states of Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth, lies Macedonia, a kingdom that southern Greeks often viewed with suspicion and mild arrogance, not because Macedonia was irrelevant, but because it did not fit neatly into the Greek city-state model. It was ruled by kings, it contained tribes and regional groups. It was closer to a centralized monarchy than to a debating assembly on a hill, and to many Greeks, this looked less refined, less civilized, less politically free, and yet, history often shows that what looks less refined can sometimes be more stable, and stability, when combined with ambition, becomes a powerful engine. Macedonia is not a sudden invention, it has existed for a long time, and it has interacted with Greek culture in many ways, but the turning point comes with a leader who is both pragmatic and visionary, Philip II, and to understand Philip we should imagine a man who looks at the Greek world not with romantic admiration, but with careful calculation, because he sees a region full of wealth and talent, but also full of division, and he understands that division is a weakness, and that weaknesses, in the right hands, can be turned into opportunities. Philip's rise to power in Macedonia happens in a world where threats are everywhere, because Macedonia's northern borders face dangers from tribes, raids, instability, and internal rivalries, and the Macedonian kingdom itself has periods of weakness and chaos, and Philip's achievement is not simply to wear a crown, but to create control, to build a system that can last beyond one lucky season. One of Philip's greatest strengths is that he is both a military reformer and a political manipulator, and these two sides of him work together like two hands shaping the same piece of clay, because military power without political skill can become wasteful, and political skill without military force can become fragile, but Philip learns how to combine both into a steady strategy. He reforms the Macedonian army in ways that shift the balance of power in Greece, and this is not only about having more soldiers, it is about changing how soldiers fight, how they train, how they move, and how they remain loyal, because armies in the ancient world are not simply machines, they are people with fear, hunger, ambition, and fatigue, and the most effective armies are those that can keep discipline through all of that. Philip's Macedonian army becomes famous for its use of the sarissa, the long spear, longer than the traditional Greek hoplite spear, and when many soldiers hold these long spears in formation, the front becomes a wall of points, a dangerous hedge that is difficult to break, and this formation, the Macedonian phalanx, is not identical to the old hoplite phalanx, because it is designed to work with other units, with cavalry, with flexible movement, with combined tactics. And this is key, because Greek city-states often rely heavily on hoplite battles that are relatively straightforward, heavy infantry pushing against heavy infantry, discipline against discipline, but Philip brings a more integrated approach, using cavalry effectively, using missile troops, using tactical variation, and this makes his army adaptable, and adaptability is often what defeats prideful tradition. Philip also creates a professional quality in his forces, not necessarily professional in the modern paid army sense alone, but professional in organization, because soldiers are trained as a system, they become used to movement, used to coordination, used to executing plans rather than simply charging into a clash. Now, while Philip is building this strength, Greece is still busy with its own internal patterns. Thebes has risen and challenged Sparta, Athens is trying to recover influence, Sparta is weakened but still proud, Corinth has its interests, smaller cities watch and choose sides, and Greece is still full of speeches, alliances, and suspicion, and in the background of all of this, Philip grows stronger. At first, Macedonia's rise might not feel like a sudden earthquake to Greeks, it might feel like a distant change, something that matters more to northern borders than to the sea-focused politics of Athens, but Philip does not intend to remain distant, he intends to step into Greek affairs directly, and he does so with a method that is almost gentle in appearance but heavy in consequence, diplomacy and intervention. Philip understands that Greek city-states can be defeated not only by direct invasion, but by the careful use of their own rivalries, and he watches their disputes like a patient hunter watching movement in a field, waiting for the right moment, and when that moment comes, he steps in not as a conqueror at first, but as an ally, a mediator, a protector, a problem solver. Because Greeks are often willing to accept outside help if they believe it helps them against their immediate rival. This is one of the most important lessons of Greek politics in this era, that the city-states are so competitive that they sometimes invite the very force that will later dominate them, because in the moment, survival feels more urgent than long-term independence. Philip becomes involved in conflicts like the Sacred Wars, disputes connected to Delphi and religious politics, and these wars are not only about religion, they are about power, because Delphi is a sacred center, and sacred centers carry prestige and influence, and when cities fight over influence in sacred spaces, they are also fighting over legitimacy. Philip uses these opportunities to expand Macedonian influence southward, gaining territory, gaining alliances, gaining recognition, and as he does this, some Greek leaders begin to realize that Philip is not just a northern king passing through, he is becoming a central figure in Greek affairs. Athens, especially, begins to feel uneasy, because Athens understands what empire looks like. Athens once built an Aegean system of control, and Athens can sense when another power is building one, even if it uses different methods, and this is where the political world of Athens produces one of its most famous voices, Demosthenes. Demosthenes becomes known for speeches warning about Philip, arguing that Macedonia's growth is a danger, urging Athens to take action, to build alliances, to resist, and in his speeches you can feel the urgency of someone watching a slow wave approaching, because the danger does not arrive as a sudden surprise, it arrives as a gradual certainty. Yet Athens is complicated, because Athens is democratic, which means debate is constant, agreement is difficult, and action can be slow, and many Athenians are tired of war, tired of expensive campaigns, tired of instability, and when people are tired, warnings can sound like noise rather than clarity. Meanwhile, other city-states choose their own approaches, some cooperate with Philip, some resist, some shift sides depending on advantage, and Philip continues to expand influence not only with force but with rewards, because rewarding loyalty is sometimes easier than crushing rebellion, and Philip is skilled at using both. Over time, the central conflict becomes unavoidable, because Greek independence and Macedonian leadership cannot both remain fully true at the same time, and the tension grows toward a decisive confrontation, and that confrontation becomes the Battle of Kyrenia. Kyrenia is not simply a battlefield, it is the moment when the Greek world discovers that the age of independent city-state dominance is ending, because when Athens and Thebes unite against Philip, they represent the last major attempt of traditional Greek powers to stop Macedonian control, and the battle becomes a test of old pride against new organization. Imagine the armies moving toward each other, not in a cinematic flash, but in slow ancient reality, dust rising from sandals and hooves, soldiers adjusting shields, men looking at the line beside them, remembering training, remembering fear, remembering that once the clash begins, the world becomes noise and pressure and instinct, and in such moments, the future of a region can depend on whether a line holds for 5 minutes longer or breaks 5 minutes earlier. The Greek side includes experienced hoplites, brave soldiers, and among them the Theban sacred band, an elite force known for discipline and courage, and Athens brings citizens fighting for the freedom and pride of their city, and in their minds this battle is not only about territory, it is about identity, it is about whether Greek politics will remain Greek in the old sense. Philip's army, however, is trained for coordination, and it includes Macedonian phalanx units supported by cavalry, and here we find one of the most important details of Kyrenia, that Philip does not only fight with strength, he fights with strategy, and ancient accounts suggest tactical maneuvers that draw parts of the Greek line into vulnerability, and once a line begins to lose cohesion, the battle changes quickly. It is during Kyrenia that Alexander, Philip's young son, is often connected to a significant role, commanding cavalry, or leading a decisive attack, and whether every detail is perfectly recorded or not, the larger truth is that Alexander's presence in this battle represents the next generation, the future of Macedonian power, stepping onto the stage. And the outcome of Kyrenia is decisive. Athens and Thebes are defeated, the sacred band is destroyed or broken, and the message spreads across Greece, not in joy, not in celebration, but in shock, because the old centers of Greek power have been beaten by the northern kingdom they once looked down upon. After Kyrenia, Philip does not destroy Athens completely, because he understands the value of Athens' culture and economy, and also because control can be more stable when you allow a defeated city to survive with dignity. But the political reality has changed. Greece is now under Macedonian hegemony, and Philip begins organizing Greek city-states into a broader structure often associated with the League of Corinth, a system meant to coordinate Greece under Macedonian leadership.